Jason Miller, a small-town mechanic, was working late at his auto shop when an otherworldly light flooded the garage. Stepping outside, he froze. Hovering above the junkyard behind his shop was a silent, pulsating UFO, its eerie green glow illuminating the night. But it wasn't the ship that terrified him. It was the shadowy figures that emerged from it. What follows is a chilling sequence of events that will make you question humanity's safety. Brace yourself for a tale that's out of this world. Jason Miller stood in the quiet of his auto shop, the only sounds coming from the occasional creak of metal and the low hum of a fluorescent light above. It was well past midnight, and the small garage on the outskirts of town felt more isolated than usual. He had taken on an extra project, rebuilding the engine of a beat-up Chevy, to distract himself from the monotony of his life. The air outside was frigid, and frost clung stubbornly to the corners of the shop's grimy windows. As Jason wiped his grease-streaked hands on a rag, he noticed something odd. His tools, scattered across the workbench, were vibrating ever so slightly. He frowned and set the wrench he was holding down, watching as it trembled against the wood. He checked the floor for signs of machinery running nearby, but the shop was silent. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. The hum in the air grew louder, a low-frequency drone that seemed to resonate in his chest. The light above him flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Jason's unease deepened. He pushed open the side door of the shop, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. The hum was louder now, more like a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Stepping out into the junkyard behind the shop, Jason froze. Above the piles of rusted car parts and twisted metal hovered a massive, glowing object. Its surface was sleek and reflective, catching the faint moonlight and throwing it back in a distorted kaleidoscope of greens and silvers. It was shaped like a disc, but its edges shimmered, almost as if it were slightly out of phase with reality. Jason's mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. A drone? Some kind of experimental aircraft? But no. This thing was far too large, and it moved with an eerie, deliberate silence that no machine he knew of could achieve. The hum vibrated through his very bones now, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, a beam of light shot down from the underside of the craft, illuminating a section of the junkyard. The beam wasn't harsh like a spotlight. It was soft, almost liquid, and it seemed to ripple as it moved. Jason squinted, his heart pounding. Then, without warning, the light shifted, landing directly on him. "Shit!" he yelped, stumbling backward. The rag fell from his hand, forgotten. He shielded his eyes, but the light wasn't blinding. Instead, it seemed to envelop him, wrapping him in a strange warmth that was at odds with the chill of the night. His breath came in shallow gasps as the hum grew louder, a deafening symphony that seemed to speak directly to his mind. Jason turned to run, but his legs felt like lead. He glanced back at the craft, and his blood ran cold. Dark, humanoid shapes began to emerge from the light, their forms silhouetted against the glow. They were tall, at least 7 feet, and impossibly thin, their limbs too long and their movements unnaturally fluid. Jason's instincts screamed at him to flee, but he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a terror unlike anything he'd ever known. One of the figures raised an arm, its spindly hand extending toward him. Jason's vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. But instead of collapsing, he felt a strange pull, as if something was drawing him closer to the craft. His feet moved of their own accord, dragging him toward the beam of light. "No, no, no," he whispered, panic clawing at his throat. He fought against the invisible force, but it was like trying to swim against a riptide. His boots scraped against the gravel, but he couldn't stop himself. The figures grew clearer as he approached, their faces, if they could be called that, void of any features save for large, unblinking eyes that seemed to bore into his very soul. Just as Jason crossed into the beam of light, everything stopped. The hum vanished, the figures froze, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Jason found himself suspended in the glow, weightless and disoriented. The silence was oppressive, a stark contrast to the cacophony that had filled the air moments before. And then, a voice, not a sound, but a thought, pierced his mind. "We mean no harm," it said, the words smooth and emotionless. "We require your assistance." Jason's breath hitched. His mind rebelled against the impossibility of what was happening, but the voice continued. "Do not fear. You have been chosen." Before Jason could respond, the beam of light retracted, and the figures dissolved into the shadows. The craft began to ascend, its glow dimming as it rose higher into the sky. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving behind only the faint hum that gradually faded into silence. Jason collapsed to his knees, his body trembling. The junkyard was dark once more, the only light coming from the dim bulb above the shop's back door. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where the craft had been. His mind raced with questions, but one thought overpowered the rest. What had they meant by chosen? Jason Miller remained on his knees in the junkyard, the cold seeping through his jeans as his breath came in ragged gasps. The night was eerily silent now, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the piles of scrap metal. His mind replayed the events of the last few minutes on an endless loop. The light, the figures, the voice. "We require your assistance." The words echoed in his head, impossible to shake. Shaking himself out of his stupor, Jason stumbled to his feet and hurried back into the garage. Slamming the door behind him, he flipped the lock and leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. For a moment, he thought he might be losing his mind. Maybe he had inhaled too many fumes from the solvents earlier. Maybe the long hours had finally caught up with him. But the memory of the figures, their impossibly long limbs and those eyes, was seared into his brain, too vivid to dismiss. Jason moved to the workbench, his hands trembling as he grabbed a bottle of water. He chugged it down, hoping the cold liquid might ground him. But as he set the bottle down, he noticed something strange. The tools that had vibrated earlier were now completely still, except for a wrench at the edge of the bench. It moved again, ever so slightly, as if nudged by an unseen force. "Come on," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Pull it together, man." The wrench suddenly slid off the table and clattered to the ground. Jason jumped back, his pulse spiking. He stared at the tool, now lying motionless on the concrete floor. Before he could process what had just happened, the hum returned. It was faint at first, a low vibration that tickled the edges of his consciousness, but it grew louder by the second. The overhead lights began to flicker violently, casting the garage in disorienting strobes of light and shadow. "Not again," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising hum. He turned toward the garage door, half expecting the glowing craft to reappear, but instead, the lights went out entirely. Jason was plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of the junkyard through the grimy windows. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that made his ears ring. And then he felt it. A presence. Jason Miller. The voice was inside his head again, but this time it wasn't calm. It was insistent, almost commanding. Jason spun around, his eyes darting through the darkness, but he saw nothing. His hands fumbled for a flashlight on the workbench, and when he finally clicked it on, the beam revealed a shadowy figure standing near the back wall of the garage. It wasn't one of the humanoid beings from before. This figure was shorter, more human-like, but its proportions were still off. Its head was slightly too large, its arms too long. Jason staggered backward, the flashlight shaking in his hands. The beam landed on the figure's face and he felt his stomach churn. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its angular features, and its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's. "What? What do you want?" Jason stammered, his voice cracking. The figure tilted its head as if studying him. "You have been chosen," it said aloud this time, its voice guttural and distorted. "You must assist us." Jason shook his head, panic bubbling up in his chest. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't even know what you are." The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth. Jason tried to back away, but his foot caught on a loose tool, and he stumbled. The flashlight clattered to the ground, the beam spinning wildly across the room. The figure was on him in an instant, its cold, spindly fingers gripping his arm with unnatural strength. "You will understand," it said, and before Jason could scream, his vision went white. For a moment, he thought he was dead. His mind was filled with flashes of images, planets orbiting distant stars, alien landscapes teeming with strange creatures, and finally, a massive warship looming over Earth, its weapons primed. The images came too fast to process, each one more terrifying than the last. Jason felt as though his brain might explode under the weight of the information being forced into it. When his vision cleared, he was back in the garage, lying on the cold concrete floor. The figure was gone, and the lights had stopped flickering. Jason sat up slowly, his head pounding. He touched his temple and winced, his fingers coming away slick with sweat. He glanced around the garage, half expecting the figure to reappear, but he was alone. The images were still fresh in his mind, burned into his memory. He could see the warship clearly, its sleek black surface covered in glowing symbols that seemed to shift and change. And then there were the creatures, an entire army of them, marching in unison under the shadow of the ship. Jason shuddered, the realization hitting him like a freight train. They weren't here for peaceful reasons. They were preparing for something big. Jason stumbled to his feet, his legs weak beneath him. He grabbed the flashlight and turned it off, plunging the room into darkness once more. He needed to think, to figure out what to do next. But as he moved toward the door, the hum returned, louder and more menacing than before. Jason stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. The garage door rattled violently, as if something massive was trying to force its way inside. He froze, his breath hitching as the rattling stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, and Jason held his breath, waiting for whatever was coming next. A single knock echoed through the garage, loud and deliberate. Jason's blood ran cold. Jason stood frozen in place, the echo of the knock reverberating through the silent garage. His breath hitched and his mind raced. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to flee into the night and never look back, but his legs refused to move. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't going to wait much longer. Slowly, Jason edged toward the workbench, his hands trembling as he reached for a wrench. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. His fingers closed around the cold metal, and he tightened his grip, willing his heart to stop hammering in his chest. He turned toward the door, every muscle in his body taut with anticipation. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. There was no response. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, until Jason thought he might go mad from the tension. And then, the door creaked open. Not all the way, just enough for a sliver of moonlight to spill into the garage. Jason's knuckles whitened around the wrench as he stared at the gap, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Jason Miller," a voice said, smooth and emotionless. It wasn't inside his head this time. It came from the other side of the door, and it sounded human. Too human. Jason's grip on the wrench faltered. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The door opened wider, and a figure stepped into the garage. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent light. His eyes were a piercing blue, so bright they seemed to glow. He wore a simple black suit, immaculate and unwrinkled, and his movements were unnaturally fluid, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. "My name is irrelevant," the man said, his voice calm and detached. "I am here to deliver a message." Jason tightened his grip on the wrench, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. "What kind of message?" The man stepped closer, his glowing eyes locked onto Jason's. You have been chosen for a task of great importance. The beings you encountered earlier require your assistance." Jason shook his head, backing away. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't even know what those things are." "They are not things," the man said, his tone sharp. "They are an advanced species from beyond your comprehension. They have come to your world because they believe you possess the skills necessary to aid them." Jason's back hit the workbench, and he realized he had nowhere left to go. "Aid them with what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man tilted his head as if considering the question. "They require you to repair a piece of their technology. It is vital to their mission." Jason barked out a humorless laugh, his fear momentarily giving way to disbelief. "I'm a mechanic, not a scientist. I fix cars, not alien tech." "And yet, they have chosen you," the man said, his glowing eyes unblinking. "You will comply, or there will be consequences." Jason's stomach churned at the cold finality in the man's voice. "What kind of consequences?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, no larger than a smartphone. He held it up, and Jason felt a strange sensation wash over him. It was as if his mind was being pulled in two directions at once, like a tug-of-war between his thoughts and an invisible force. Images began to flash before his eyes, images of destruction. He saw cities crumbling into dust, their once tall skyscrapers reduced to rubble. He saw rivers running red with blood and skies choked with smoke. He saw the faces of people he knew, friends, neighbors, even strangers, twisted in agony as they tried to flee an unseen terror. And above it all, he saw the same warship from his earlier vision, its glowing symbols casting an ominous light over the devastation. Jason fell to his knees, the wrench slipping from his grasp. The images stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving him gasping for air. The man pocketed the device and looked down at him, his expression unreadable. "You will comply," he said again, his voice devoid of emotion. "You have no other choice." Jason clenched his fists, anger bubbling up beneath his fear. "And what if I don't? What if I tell you and your alien friends to go to hell?" The man didn't react. "Then your world will burn." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Jason felt the weight of them settle on his shoulders. He wanted to scream, to fight back, to do anything other than bow to these otherworldly demands, but he knew deep down that he was outmatched. Whatever these beings were, they had power far beyond anything he could comprehend. The man stepped back, his glowing eyes never leaving Jason's. "You will be contacted again soon. Be ready." Before Jason could respond, the man turned and walked out of the garage, disappearing into the night as quickly and silently as he had appeared. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Jason alone in the flickering light of the garage. He sank to the floor, his body trembling as he tried to process what had just happened. Jason sat in the garage for hours, his mind racing. The man's words echoed in his head. "You will comply, or there will be consequences." He had no doubt that the images of destruction were real, but the thought of helping these beings filled him with dread. What were they planning? And why had they chosen him, of all people? The hum returned, low and menacing, vibrating through the walls of the garage. Jason scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. He scanned the room, half expecting the glowing-eyed man to reappear, but the garage remained empty. Still, the hum grew louder, and Jason realized it wasn't coming from inside. It was coming from above. He burst out of the garage and into the junkyard. The night was unnaturally still, the air heavy with anticipation. Jason tilted his head back and his breath caught in his throat. The craft had returned, hovering silently above the junkyard. Its sleek surface shimmered in the moonlight, and Jason felt the same pull he had experienced before, a strange magnetic force that seemed to draw him closer. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "Not again." But his body betrayed him. His legs moved of their own accord, dragging him toward the craft. He fought against the invisible force, but it was no use. He stumbled into the center of the junkyard, the beam of light from the craft enveloping him. For a moment, he felt weightless, suspended in the glow. Then, everything went dark. When Jason opened his eyes, he was no longer in the junkyard. He was standing in a sterile metallic room, the walls smooth and featureless. The air was cool and filled with a faint hum that seemed to resonate in his bones. Jason's pulse quickened as he took in his surroundings. There was no sign of the craft, the junkyard, or the garage. He was completely alone. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice echoing in the empty room. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, its movements eerily smooth. It was one of the beings from before, tall, thin, and otherworldly. Its large, unblinking eyes fixed on Jason, and he felt a chill run down his spine. "Jason Miller," the being said, its voice a strange blend of mechanical tones and human inflection. "You have been brought aboard our vessel." Jason swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Why? What do you want from me?" The being tilted its head as if considering his question. "We require your assistance to repair our primary weapon system. It is malfunctioning, and we cannot complete our mission without it." Jason's heart sank. "Your weapon system? What kind of mission are you talking about?" The being didn't answer. Instead, it raised a spindly arm and pointed to a panel on the wall. The metal surface shifted, revealing a holographic display. Jason watched in horror as the display showed Earth, surrounded by a fleet of alien warships. The ships moved in perfect unison, their weapons glowing with ominous energy. "Our mission is to prepare your planet for integration," the being said. "The weapon system is essential to neutralize resistance." "Integration?" Jason asked, his voice trembling. "What does that mean?" The being turned its unblinking gaze on him. "Your species will be assimilated. Resistance is futile." Jason's stomach churned. "You want me to help you destroy my own planet? You're insane if you think I'll do that." The being didn't react to his outburst. "Your cooperation will minimize casualties. Without your assistance, the devastation will be total." Jason clenched his fists, anger bubbling up beneath his fear. "You think I'm just going to roll over and help you kill billions of people? Forget it." The being stepped closer, its towering form casting a shadow over Jason. "Your cooperation will minimize casualties. Without it, there will be total destruction." Jason's mind raced. He couldn't trust these creatures, but he couldn't fight them either. They were far too powerful, their technology beyond anything he could comprehend. But if he could find a way to sabotage their plans, maybe, just maybe, he could save his planet. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll help you, but I need to see the system you want me to fix." The being regarded him for a long moment before nodding. "Follow." Jason was led through a series of corridors, each identical to the last. The walls pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light, and the air was thick with a metallic tang. Jason's mind worked furiously as he walked, trying to come up with a plan. He didn't know how much time he had, but he knew he had to act fast. They entered a large chamber filled with alien machinery. The centerpiece was a massive, cylindrical device that pulsed with green light. Jason's eyes widened as he took in the intricate network of wires, panels, and conduits that surrounded it. It looked like something out of a nightmare. "This is the weapon system," the being said. "You will repair it." Jason approached the device, his hands shaking. He had no idea where to start, but he couldn't let the being know that. He ran his fingers over the surface, pretending to examine it. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way to disable the system without alerting his captors. As he worked, he noticed a small panel near the base of the device. It was slightly ajar, revealing a cluster of glowing wires. Jason's heart skipped a beat. If he could sever those wires, it might disable the system. But he had to be careful. The being was watching his every move. Jason took a deep breath and reached for the panel, his fingers brushing against the wires. The hum of the device grew louder, and Jason felt a surge of panic. If he made the wrong move, the system might activate. But he had no choice. He had to try. With a swift motion, Jason yanked the wires free. The device emitted a high-pitched whine, and the green light flickered. The being stepped forward, its eyes narrowing. "What have you done?" it demanded. Jason backed away, his heart pounding. I didn't mean to. I must have hit the wrong wire." The being stared at him for a long moment before turning its attention back to the device. Jason seized the opportunity and bolted for the door, his adrenaline pumping. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to get out of there. As he ran, alarms blared through the corridors, the shrill sound echoing off the metallic walls. Jason's lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead, but he didn't stop. He turned corner after corner, the layout of the ship a confusing maze. Finally, he spotted an airlock at the end of a corridor. He sprinted toward it, his heart pounding in his ears. He had no idea what was on the other side, but it didn't matter. He couldn't stay on the ship. Jason slammed his hand against the control panel and the airlock hissed open. Without hesitation, he stepped inside and hit the release. The outer door opened and Jason felt himself being pulled into the void. And then everything went black. Jason awoke with a jolt, gasping for air. His head throbbed and his body felt as though it had been through a meat grinder. He blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The sterile metallic walls were gone, replaced by the cracked concrete of what looked like an abandoned factory. Shafts of light filtered through shattered windows, illuminating the dust that hung in the air like smoke. "Where am I?" Jason muttered, his voice hoarse. He sat up slowly, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. His last memory was of the airlock, the rush of the void, and then nothing. How had he ended up here? His hands instinctively went to his pocket, searching for his phone, but it was gone. Everything he had on him, his tools, his wallet, had vanished. Jason staggered to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. The room was massive, filled with rusted machinery and piles of scrap metal. The hum was gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. But something felt off. His skin prickled, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He wasn't alone. "Jason Miller," a voice echoed through the cavernous space. Jason spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. At the far end of the room, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the man in the black suit, his glowing blue eyes cutting through the dim light like searchlights. Jason stumbled backward, his pulse racing. "You've got to be kidding me," Jason said, his voice shaking. "What do you want now?" The man stepped closer, his movements smooth and deliberate. "You sabotaged the weapon system. That was unwise." Jason clenched his fists, anger flaring despite his fear. "You expect me to help you destroy my planet? You're insane." The man tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Your actions have complicated matters. The weapon system was designed to minimize casualties. Without it, the integration process will be far more destructive." "Good," Jason spat. "Maybe your whole operation will fall apart." The man didn't react to Jason's defiance. Instead, he raised his hand and Jason felt an invisible force slam into him, pinning him against the wall. His breath came in short gasps as the pressure on his chest increased, like a massive weight pressing down on him. "You do not understand the gravity of your actions," the man said, his voice eerily calm. "You have jeopardized the mission, and by extension, your entire species." Jason struggled against the invisible force, his vision swimming. "Why, me?" he managed to choke out. "Why am I so important to you?" The man released him, and Jason crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. "You possess a unique ability," the man said. "Your skills are not merely mechanical. You have a resonance with our technology. It is rare among your kind." Jason coughed, his head spinning. Resonance? What the hell are you talking about? The man ignored his question. The warship will arrive in 24 hours. With the weapon system disabled, the integration process will begin without precision. Billions will perish. Your only chance to mitigate the damage is to repair what you have broken. Jason's blood ran cold. And if I refuse? The man's glowing eyes seemed to bore into his soul. Then your world will burn. Jason stared at him, his mind racing. He didn't trust this man, or whatever he was, but if there was even a shred of truth to what he was saying, Jason couldn't sit idly by and let billions of people die. But he also couldn't blindly follow their orders. He needed a plan. Fine, Jason said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Take me back to the ship. I'll fix it. The man studied him for a moment, then nodded. Follow me. Jason followed the man through a rusted doorway, his mind working furiously. He didn't have much time, and he needed to think of a way to stop the aliens once and for all. The man led him into a narrow corridor where a strange, pulsating portal awaited. Its surface shimmered like liquid mercury, and Jason hesitated as he approached it. What is that? Jason asked. Your passage back to the vessel, the man replied. Step through. Jason clenched his fists, steeling himself. With a deep breath, he stepped into the portal. The sensation was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. His body felt weightless, as though he were floating through water, yet he could breathe freely. Colors swirled around him, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. When the sensation subsided, Jason found himself back in the metallic room aboard the alien ship. The green light of the weapon system pulsed ominously, and the hum resonated through the air, vibrating in his chest. The being from before, the one with the unblinking eyes, stood waiting for him. You have returned, it said, its mechanical voice devoid of emotion. Jason forced himself to nod. Yeah, I'm here. Let's get this over with. The being gestured toward the weapon system. Proceed. Jason approached the device, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, both the glowing-eyed man and the alien. He knelt by the open panel, his mind racing. He needed to stall, to buy himself time to figure out his next move. As he pretended to inspect the wires, his gaze fell on a small, glowing module tucked inside the device. It was no larger than a baseball, and its surface shimmered with intricate patterns. Jason's gut told him this was the power source. If he could remove it, the entire system might shut down. Jason glanced over his shoulder. The beings were watching him closely, their expressions unreadable. He turned back to the device, his fingers trembling as he reached for the module. With a swift motion, he yanked it free. The reaction was immediate. The weapon system emitted a piercing screech and the green light dimmed. Jason scrambled to his feet, clutching the module tightly. The being stepped forward, its eyes narrowing. "What have you done?" it demanded. Jason backed away, holding the module like a lifeline. "I'm ending this. You're not taking my planet." The being lunged at him, but Jason was faster. He bolted for the door, adrenaline propelling him forward. Alarms blared as he sprinted through the corridors, the metallic walls a blur. He didn't know where he was going, but he didn't care. All that mattered was escaping with the module. Jason turned a corner and skidded to a halt. Ahead of him was the airlock, the same one he had used to escape before. He sprinted toward it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The alarms grew louder, the ship's hum reaching a deafening pitch. Jason slammed his hand against the control panel and the airlock hissed open. He stepped inside, gripping the module tightly. With a deep breath, he hit the release. The outer door opened and Jason was pulled into the void. This time, he didn't black out. As he floated in the darkness, the module in his hand pulsed faintly, its glow illuminating his face. Jason stared at the distant Earth, a fragile blue orb against the backdrop of infinite space. He didn't know if his actions would be enough to stop the invasion, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. Jason drifted in the silent void of space, the glowing module pulsing faintly in his hands. Earth loomed in the distance, a fragile blue orb surrounded by the infinite darkness. Despite the overwhelming emptiness, Jason felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. The module was his last hope, the only thing standing between his planet and total annihilation. He couldn't let it end here. As he floated, Jason felt a familiar vibration ripple through his body. The hum. It was faint, but it was growing stronger by the second. He turned his head and saw it, the alien warship. It had materialized from the darkness, its sleek, menacing form gliding silently through the void. The ship's surface shimmered with a strange, otherworldly energy, and Jason knew they were coming for him. No, 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 Jason muttered, clutching the module tighter. His mind raced as he tried to think of a plan. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and stranded in space with no way to fight back. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The hum grew louder, and Jason realized the ship was moving toward him. Its massive form cast a shadow over him, blocking out the distant stars. A beam of light shot out from its underside, engulfing Jason in its glow. He felt the familiar pull, the magnetic force dragging him toward the ship. He fought against it, but it was useless. The module slipped from his grasp, floating just out of reach. "No!" Jason screamed, reaching for the module. His fingers brushed against its surface, and he managed to grab it just as the light enveloped him completely. When the light faded, Jason found himself back inside the alien ship. He was lying on the cold metallic floor, the module still clutched in his hands. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. The room was eerily quiet, the hum vibrating through the walls. Jason tightened his grip on the module, his eyes darting around the room. "You cannot win," a voice echoed, smooth and emotionless. Jason turned to see the glowing-eyed man standing at the far end of the room, his expression unreadable. "Return the module and accept your fate. Resistance is futile." Jason shook his head, his fear giving way to defiance. "I'm not giving up. You can't have this." The man stepped closer, his glowing eyes narrowing. "You do not understand what you are dealing with. The integration process is inevitable. Your actions will only prolong the suffering of your species." "Maybe," Jason said, his voice steady, "but at least I'm fighting back." The man raised his hand, and Jason felt the invisible force slam into him, knocking him to the ground. The module rolled out of his grasp, coming to a stop near the base of the weapon system. Jason groaned, his body aching as he struggled to get up. The man moved toward the module, his glowing eyes fixed on it. Jason's mind raced. He couldn't let the man take the module. It was his only chance to stop the invasion. Summoning all his strength, Jason lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. The impact sent the module skittering across the floor, and Jason scrambled to grab it. The man recovered quickly, his movements unnaturally smooth. He grabbed Jason by the arm, his grip like iron. "You cannot stop us," he said, his voice cold and mechanical. Jason gritted his teeth, his anger fueling his strength. "Watch me!" With a burst of adrenaline, Jason broke free from the man's grip and sprinted toward the weapon system. The alarms blared, and the green light of the system pulsed erratically. Jason reached the open panel and shoved the module inside, his fingers moving instinctively as he connected it to the device. The reaction was immediate. The weapon system emitted a high-pitched screech, and the entire ship began to shake. Jason stumbled backward, his heart pounding as the green light intensified, bathing the room in an eerie glow. "What have you done?" the man demanded, his glowing eyes wide with anger. Jason backed away, his chest heaving. "I'm ending this. Your invasion is over." The ship's hum grew deafening, and Jason felt the floor beneath him begin to crumble. The light of the weapon system flickered, then exploded in a blinding flash. Jason was thrown off his feet, the force of the blast knocking the air out of his lungs. When the light faded, Jason opened his eyes to find himself floating in space once again. The alien warship was gone, reduced to a cloud of debris that shimmered faintly in the starlight. Jason clutched his chest, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. He had done it. He had stopped the invasion. But he wasn't safe yet. Jason glanced around, searching for any sign of rescue. His oxygen was running low and the cold of space was seeping into his bones. He stared at the distant Earth, a sense of longing washing over him. He had fought so hard to save his planet, but now it seemed he wouldn't live to see it again. Just as Jason was beginning to lose hope, a beam of light appeared, cutting through the darkness. He turned his head and saw a ship, this one smaller and less menacing than the alien warship. It moved toward him, its lights blinking like a beacon. Jason felt himself being pulled toward the ship, the same magnetic force dragging him through the void. But this time, he didn't fight it. He let the light envelop him, his body too weak to resist. When he woke, Jason was lying on a soft bed, the hum of the ship faint in the background. A figure leaned over him, their face blurry. Jason blinked, his vision clearing. It was a human, a man in a flight suit, his expression one of relief. "You're safe," the man said, his voice steady. "We picked up your distress signal." Jason tried to speak, but his throat was dry. The man handed him a bottle of water, and Jason drank greedily, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. "Where am I?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're aboard a rescue vessel," the man said. "We're taking you back to Earth." Jason sank back against the pillow, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. He had survived. Somehow, against all odds, he had made it. But as he closed his eyes, the images of the alien warship and the glowing-eyed man lingered in his mind. The fight was over, but Jason knew the truth. This wasn't the end. The aliens would return. And when they did, Jason would be ready.